Thanks to movies, martial arts, and also because they're super cool, we spend a lot of time talking about and looking at and using swords. However, most of you by now will realise that these actually were by far not the most important weapons on the historical battlefield. And throughout history, a significant amount of infantry carried types of pole weapon, like this flail here, or this poleaxe here. And of course the spear, one of the most ancient, probably the most ancient weapon used for hunting and warfare, used by cultures all over the world for all of known human history and prehistory, is probably the most important weapon of warfare of all time. While the spear reigns absolutely supreme in close hand-to-hand combat, throughout history one of the other most important weapons that's been used in a vast majority of cultures around the world is, of course, the bow of various different sorts. And the bow absolutely deserves to be up there with probably the second or perhaps even the first most important weapon alongside the spear. But I do find that in recent years, particularly on the internet and here on YouTube, there's been a certain focus on bows, particularly around armour penetration and rate of fire. I'm going to use that expression. I know it doesn't work well for bows because there's no fire, but I'm going to use it because it is easy to use. So rate of shooting, rate of fire and armour penetration. And I can't help thinking, when we actually look at the historical accounts that we've got and what we know about period archery, that we're sort of missing some nuance and details here, and maybe those two things aren't as important as we thought. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now we're going to be looking here at bows and perhaps how we need to slightly change how we look at their use in historical warfare, and perhaps we've been overly fixated and overly focusing on a couple of things, particularly around armour penetration and particularly around rate of fire or rate of shooting. We're going to look at those two things. Now, before I go on, just to briefly mention, this video is kindly sponsored by Surfshark, but we're going to talk more about that in a minute. So, what is it that I think we're missing about historical archery? Well, the first thing we absolutely have to mention to set some context is that we know that cultures throughout the world, all the way from sort of a tribal level, a Stone Age culture, all the way up to the height of the Renaissance, bows were incredibly important. So regardless of all other details, we have to always remind ourselves that the bow remained relevant and really, really potent. Even to the degree that, you know, in the age of Henry VIII, for example, that Tudor flagship Mary Rose, which sunk and preserves so much information for us, contains all of that material culture of the archers on board, the bows, the bracers, the arrow spacer sort of quiver things, the arrowheads, parts of the arrows, you know, all of that stuff was preserved. And this is on a battleship, essentially, a galleon, which was absolutely full of cannons. And in fact, it had even more cannons added. So in an age where gunpowder was really coming to its own, the bow was still super important. And of course, this was also true of the Ottoman expansion into what's now southern Europe and elsewhere. The fact that they had large bombards and cannons able to breach the walls of Constantinople and various other places, it didn't stop them from making extensive use of archery. And that was also true in India, it was also true in China and North Africa as well. So the bow remained relevant and very, very potent. But is armour penetration and is rate of fire actually as important as modern kind of influencers might have led you to believe? And I would argue no. But before we go on, a quick word about our sponsors for this video, Surfshark. Well, you guys know that I always use protection, right? Well, whether it's a suit of armour or just practicing my parries and dodges. And it even goes for my online life as well. And as you guys can see, a lot of my life these days is lived online. So I reckon that just about everybody watching this video will know what a VPN is, a virtual private network. Well, you might be using one right now, or you might have tried ones in the past, or maybe you've been thinking about getting one. Well, don't wait. And apart from keeping you safer while browsing, downloading, shopping or doing whatever, Surfshark can also do something really important for you as well, which is getting harder to come by these days: and give you freedom. And honestly, those of us here in the UK, for example, are only too used to increasing levels of government monitoring, regulation and rules. People like me and lots of other people working in business who have to access their online data while they're traveling, for example, I just wouldn't feel safe doing a lot of the things that I have to do for my businesses while traveling otherwise. Most people don't realize how blinkered their view of the internet is based on what their IP address is. Well, Surfshark can help you get around that. With Surfshark, you'll be able to browse, for example, Netflix or other streaming services and see things which literally you can't see in your country by changing your IP address. I'll tell you, you'll thank me when you try it, and so will your family as well. Now, to do this, Surfshark offers over 4,500 different servers in 140 different locations. So there's a variety of servers for every possible one of your needs. You can pick the one that works best for you. And from clothes shopping to booking flights, you can get better deals like this as well. And Surfshark keeps all of your data safe by being encrypted. And it's really important to note that Surfshark is a no-logs VPN, so they won't look at your data or record it either. And as well as blocking malware and viruses, Surfshark can also even block ads. Now, one of the advantages of Surfshark, which not all other VPNs offer at all, is it covers unlimited devices. And with Surfshark, you don't need to worry about anything because there's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 support. So you can try it out right now, clicking on that link down below, or you can go to surfshark.com/scholarshark. So the special code to use is ScholarShark, and that will get you 4 additional months of Surfshark VPN. You won't regret it, and there's no risk at all. So check it out now, and you can thank me later. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the main topic of this video. So the first thing we're going to look at here is rate of fire. Please don't crucify me for using that expression. People always do in the comments. It's just a modern, commonly understood terminology for the rate of shooting arrows. I know that it's a firearms term. Please just get over it. Anyway, rate of fire. So one of the things that we've seen in recent years, thanks largely, I have to say, to Lars Anderson, is some very, very good and very skilled, I don't want to undermine them, but some very, very good and skilled archers shooting arrows very quickly. Now, absolutely, there are situations where this would be advantageous. 100%. If you were a small group of archers and you came up against a larger group of people who were closing on you fast, you would want to put as many arrows into their mass as possible to wound or take out as many of them as possible before they get into hand-to-hand combat with you. Equally, if you're a group of archers versus another group of archers, whether they're more numerous or the same size as you, if you have a faster rate of fire than they do, the chances are you're going to win that archery duel. However, here's the elephant in the room. If you are an archer engaged in a battle, doesn't matter whether it's in the Greek or Roman period or whether it's in late medieval or Renaissance Europe, if you're engaged in a battle, that battle might be going on for quite a bit of time. How many arrows do you have? Okay, so if we look at an English archer during the 100 Years' War, which is obviously something we've focused on quite a lot in this channel, but it could equally be applied to Turkish archers, Ottoman archers at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. It's the same kind of situation. If you're an archer and you have, let's say, 24 arrows, which was the standard number for English archers in their sort of quivers, or let's say you have 2 of those, you have 48 arrows. Maybe you have 72 arrows, and this is the kind of range of arrows that we certainly see in England, longbowmen often referred to as having. 24, 48, maybe up to 72, this kind of number, okay? How long is, if you're shooting super, super quickly, is it going to take you to expend those arrows? A really short amount of time. Clearly, if you're shooting, let's say, 12 arrows a minute, you only have 2 minutes of continuous shooting time with 1 sheaf of arrows, 24. If you've got 2 sheaves, say you've got 48, well, that's only 4 minutes, okay? 4 minutes of shooting in a battle that's going to last maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, maybe 2 hours. You don't know. If we look at battles during the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses or the wars between Burgundy and Switzerland or wherever, this kind of late medieval period, battles could be over in 20, 30 minutes, occasionally less than that, but usually 20 or 30 minutes, or battles could be an hour or 2 hours. So, if you're an archer, you can only carry a certain number of arrows, number one, but you can only be resupplied, because I know a lot of you are going to say, to immediately start typing there in the comments, oh, but what about the wagons of stuff? Yeah, absolutely, you can have a baggage train. But how many times can you be resupplied? If you've got, let's say, 8,000 archers, or 5,000 archers, or 3,000 archers, how many times can those archers realistically, in the time available with the logistical problems of the fact that they're at the front of the battle, be resupplied? Okay, so one of the main problems with shooting really, really fast is, what do you do once your arrows are all gone? And there is an answer, but we're going to come back to that in a minute. Now, the next issue around speed shooting is, when do you do it? So one of the big questions, certainly in the studies of the 100 Years' War, for example, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, all of these, and then the later battles of the 100 Years' War, but we equally apply this to the Wars of the Roses as well, with battles like Towton or Tewkesbury or wherever, are the archers shooting at far range or at close range, or are they shooting at all ranges? Well, so if a walking army, or even just a slightly quick walking army, is coming towards you, and bear in mind most of these armies, with the exception of Crécy, were advancing on foot. Poitiers, most of the French advanced on foot. Agincourt, most of the French advanced on foot, although there was a cavalry force prior to that. Most of the Wars of the Roses battles, they were English armies against English armies, so they were advancing on foot. So in most cases, one side is usually static and the other side is advancing. If you are advancing, you've got problems shooting at the same time potentially, but if you're advancing, it takes a certain amount of time to get there. You're going to be continually shot, or are you going to be shot a bit at the beginning, maybe a bit at the middle and a bit at the end? Or are the archers going to be, like, hold your arrows until you see the whites of their eyes? Okay, and there is an advantage to doing that. We're going to stray slightly into the realms of armour penetration in a minute, but the arrows, on a fundamental level, are more potent and more effective at close range for a number of reasons. I'll explain more of that in a second. So do you save your arrows for the last? In which case, if you've saved your arrows for the last, there might be a virtue to quick shooting, because if you wait until they're only 50 yards away and then just pump as many arrows into them as possible, that might have the greatest effect on them. Or will it? If you start hitting them from sooner, you might potentially, if you've got enough arrows to supply yourself, get more arrows into the enemy, and you might make them disperse a bit, you might cause problems before they get to you. There are all sorts of advantages or disadvantages, but the problem is, if you start shooting at them when they're 200 yards away, and you can plop arrows onto them when they're 200 yards away, you might be starting to run out by the time you get close to you. So, what do the historical sources say? Well, actually, the historical sources aren't particularly helpful, because they support both sides of it. We know, for example, that there was harrying shooting done at long range at Agincourt, supposedly, and other battles as well. We know, for example, at the Battle of Towton, there was an archery duel, and one side outranged the other because one side was shooting into a storm, the other one wasn't. And so in that case, they were probably shooting at maximum range, because we know that one side couldn't reach the other side, so they must have been at maximum range. So we categorically know that sometimes, and we know this examples from battles with the Ottoman Turks as well, we know that and the Mongols, we know that sometimes archers were shooting at maximum range, and the range of their archery, sometimes they could outrange the enemy, and that was an advantage, clearly. But equally, there is also source material to suggest what we call flat shooting. That is absolutely looking for the weak point in the armour. Again, I'll get to this in a second. And aiming for it at close range, where you're going to get maximum velocity out of the arrow, maximum straight power into the target, and of course you can be more accurate because they're closer. So the problem is, we don't really know what medieval or ancient world archers did. We can see both. Sometimes they shot far away, sometimes they shot close. Did they just shoot continuously? But then, would they run out of arrows quicker? Therefore, with the rate of fire point, did they deliberately not shoot at their maximum speed most of the time because they'd run out of missiles? Let's assume I'm an English archer at the Battle of Agincourt, which lasted a fair amount of time. Let's say I only have you know, 24, 36, 48 arrows. Let's assume we don't have 72. Maybe they did have 72, but even if I've got 72, I know that I might have to be shooting for the next 20 minutes. Clearly, really probably at no point in that 20 minutes am I going to be shooting at maximum rate of shooting, because I'm going to run out of arrows. And we don't want that to happen, but equally you want to save enough arrows for when they are really close that you're going to have the greatest effect on the target. So, rate of fire, it's a desirable skill, and I have great admiration for the people who can shoot arrows really quickly, absolutely. But was it actually done that much in historical warfare? We don't really know. Now let's talk about the fixation on armour penetration. Right, I'm going to carefully put this bow down and we're going to talk about armour for a second. So without going into a huge amount of depth, if we look at arrows versus armour 1, 2 and 3, the great tests that have been done by Todd's workshop, or indeed if we look at any of the other data that we've got about people in armour being hit by arrows, the overwhelming takeaway is that certainly in the late medieval period, by the time that plate armour had become quite developed, so 14th, 15th century, it seems that for the most part people in armour were pretty safe against arrows, okay? Most of the time. But you can't protect everything. There's always going to be gaps, and there's some people are going to have slightly inferior armour that might be iron rather than steel. It might not be hardened steel. It might be thinner in some places, thinner at the sides, thicker at the front. So if you happen to get hit in one of these spots that's thinner, you might be hit somewhere where there's male articulations at the armpits, the throat, the groin, the back of the legs, the inside of the elbow. Famous example of one of the Pastons got shot in the inside of the elbow during the Wars of the Roses. So plate armour always has gaps, and there's a numbers game here. There's an odds game. If you're throwing enough stuff at the wall, some of it's going to stick, right? And that's the same case with arrows. But here's the thing, and where it relates to this video. If you're doing it from far away, it's far less likely to stick. Why? Okay, so the simple fact is that arrows, like all other projectiles, even bullets, have a trajectory. Okay, so if you are what's called flat shooting at close range, you're essentially hitting the front of the mass of men who are coming towards you for the most part. Okay, probably aiming at head height. We'll come back to that in a second. However, if you're shooting further away, your arrows are doing this. Now, much like with bullets, if you're shooting with a flatter trajectory, you're more likely to hit the target, because if you miss the thing in front, it will carry on going and hit someone behind. If you're doing this, if the arrow is doing this in the air and you fall a bit short, it will hit the ground. If you do this and it goes a bit far, it will go in the ground behind them. So in a force which is, let's say, 4 or 5 ranks deep, your chances of actually hitting anybody at all are vastly reduced when you're shooting arrows with an arc. They're far massively increased if you're flat shooting. So much so, in fact, that with bullets or with arrows, if this goes through someone who's not wearing any armour, for example, let's say it goes through their face or through their arm at close range, there's a chance that this will go through the first person and into the second person behind. That is very unlikely to happen with an arrow that's coming from further away doing this arc. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that armour tends to be really protective from above. Okay, so if we just look at 14th and 15th century armour for a second, the main thing that's likely to be hit when an arrow is being shot from further away and doing this and coming downwards, and firstly it's lost a lot of velocity as well because it's now coming down with the force of gravity, but it's lost most of its actual velocity that it left the bow with, is it's going to hit the helmet. Now there's numerous problems for the arrow doing that. Firstly, helmets are really well shaped to deflect arrows. Very unlikely that an arrow coming downwards like this is going to penetrate here. You stand a much bigger chance of an arrow coming in here and penetrating than it sailing down out of the sky, mostly from force of gravity, and hitting here. It's not going to penetrate anything. Second thing is the rest of your body. You're now from above a narrower target. You've got shoulder protection. If it's coming down here, it's going to skip off your breastplate. Even if you're just wearing mail or a gambeson, for example, if the arrow is coming downwards here, it is more likely to have to traverse more material to get into your body, but moreover, it's more likely to deflect off whatever it's hitting and actually not go straight into you. So, armour has fewer gaps from above, but it's also more deflective from above, and it's just and you're not being hit by with as much velocity as flat shooting. So, for that reason, a lot of people think, and I have been one of those people, a lot of people think that medieval archery focused on shooting straight rather than plopping the arrows down, because of the armour. But to say that medieval, let's say Ottoman, Turkish or English longbowmen or Burgundian longbowmen or even crossbowmen just focused on flat shooting at close range, I think is probably wrong. They may have focused on it more than certain other periods of archery because of the armour, but saying that they did it all the time would be wrong, because we have evidence from Towton, for example, or indeed the type of archery practice that was mandated by the Tudors, shooting at 220 yards, or indeed various other sources that describe people shooting at maximum range, like at Agincourt, for example. So we know that sometimes they did shoot at maximum range, perhaps to provoke an enemy to advance upon them, or just to wound the people who weren't wearing very much armour and annoy them, or just, you know, kind of perhaps make some of them want to run away or be not so keen to advance. Who knows? But we know that they did both things. But it might be that they focused more on the targeted flat shooting than the range shooting in the era of heavy armour. And it should be said that even from China we have some evidence in the written sources to back this up, where it suggested that archers targeted the face, because it was the least armoured part of the armour, at close range. And equally we have sources, for example, Froissart's Chronicles mentions at the Battle of Poitiers that the French knights feared that the arrows would pierce the sides of their visors, and this was at close range apparently. So absolutely, I think that, because it must have been at the side, to be at the side it must have been at close range. So I think absolutely, where heavy armour was a thing, there probably was a focus on flat shooting at close range. And in that case, would you go for rate of fire or would you go for accuracy and targeting? I can see arguments for either. What do you think? Would you advise your archers to take their time and aim for the gaps if they could be that accurate at, let's say, 50 yards? Or would you just tell them to plough as many arrows in as possible and hold those arrows back so they've got enough until the last minute? Right, so to conclude, I think there's one other last thing that often gets overlooked when we're talking about archery. And I think part of that is because, not universally the case, obviously there are exceptions, but most people who focus on archery don't usually focus on hand weapons. Usually the people who are talking a lot about these and practicing with these tend to not be the same people who are talking and practicing with these. And so I think what that's created is a bit of a separation in the dialogue. But really we must consider these two things, because anybody in the historical world using one of these would have had some kind of one of these. In other words, a hand weapon, even if it was a large knife or a hatchet, which we know was carried by some archers. But in many, many cases throughout history, they would have also had swords. And in fact, moreover, if we actually look at the period sources, we see that there's quite a lot of care taken about what armour and close combat weapons archers were equipped with. For example, in the Wars of the Roses and the late 100 Years' War, we know English archers very often wore brigandines, and they're shown wearing them over a mail shirt. So they wore a brigandine over a mail shirt and pretty much always some form of open face helmet. So they were actually pretty well armoured, far better armoured than even better armoured than some knights would have been actually in earlier centuries. And this wasn't just English archers, this is also true of certain Chinese archers as well, or indeed crossbowmen. And in fact, a lot of care was given to what hand weapons they had. So the English archers were famous for using swords and bucklers, for example. But the Dukes of Burgundy stipulated that their longbowmen had to have long swords. And if we go to Ming Dynasty China, we find that some of their crossbowmen had enormous great two-handed swords like this. So in other words, there was a huge amount of effort being paid to how effective the archers could be when they weren't shooting arrows. And that's something that gets hugely overlooked, I feel, is that we talk about rate of fire, we talk about armour penetration, and we fixate on the bows and the arrows and how these knights were being taken out by archers potentially. But then we forget that in almost every single source where archers were present, the archers were not only shooting arrows, they were usually also light infantry, sometimes armed with specialist weapons, and we've talked about the archer's maul potentially being used by the English, but at the very least we know they had swords and bucklers. Chinese crossbowmen had large two-handed swords. Burgundian longbowmen in France had long swords. They were paying a lot of attention to how effective and how useful the archers could be once they'd stopped shooting. In other words, once their arrows had probably run out. Which probably relates to some of the earlier points we've made in this video. Anyway, what do you think? Do you think, you know, I'm barking up the wrong tree? I don't think so. I think we need to look more holistically at the role of archers on historical battlefields, not just medieval European, but also Chinese, North African, Middle Eastern, and so on and so forth, because archers weren't just archers. They were soldiers who happened to have bows and swords and sometimes mauls or other things. So they were soldiers who fulfilled a role, and I think sometimes we get overly fixated on the particular bow part of their role, and we forget that just like soldiers throughout history, they were soldiers. They just had a particular weapon set to use. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. Thanks again to the sponsors for this video as well. Please make sure you're subscribed, and I will see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.